As far as I know, I was the first staffer to erase information from a story because we were threatened by Hamas, which happened at the very end of 2008. We had a great reporter in Gaza, a Palestinian, who had always been really an excellent reporter. We had a detail in a story. The detail was a crucial one. It was that Hamas fighters were dressed as civilians and were being counted as civilians in the death toll. An important thing to know, that went out in an AP story. The reporter called me a few hours later. It was clear that someone had spoken to him. And he told me, I was on the desk in Jerusalem, so I was kind of writing the story from the main bureau in Jerusalem. And he said, Mati, you have to take that detail out of the story. And it was clear that someone had threatened him. I took the detail out of the story. I suggested to our editors that we note in an editor's note that we were now complying with Hamas censorship. I was overruled. And from that point in time, the AP, like all of its sister organizations, collaborates with Hamas censorship in Gaza. What does that mean? You'll see a lot of dead civilians and you won't see dead militants. You won't have a clear idea of what the Hamas military strategy is. And this is the kicker, the center of the coverage will be a number, a casualty number that is provided to the press by something called the Gaza Health Ministry, which is Hamas. And we've been doing that since 2008. And it's a way of basically settling the story before you get into any other information. Because when you put, when you say 50 Palestinians were killed and 1 Israeli on a given day, it doesn't matter what else you say. The numbers kind of tell their own story, and it's a way of kind of settling the story with something that sounds like a concrete statistic, and the statistic is being, given to us by one of the combatant sides. But because the reporters sympathize with that side, they're happy to play along. So since 2008, certainly since 2014, when we had another serious war in Gaza, the press has not been covering in Gaza. The press has been essentially an amplifier for one of the most poisonous ideologies on earth. Hamas has figured out how to make the press amplify its messaging rather than covering Hamas. There are no Western reporters in Gaza. All of the reporters in Gaza are Palestinians, and those people fall into 3 categories. Some of them identify with Hamas. Some of them are intimidated by Hamas and won't cross Hamas, which makes a lot of sense. I wouldn't want to cross Hamas either. And the third category is people who actually belong to Hamas. That's where the information from Gaza is coming from. And if you're credulous, then of course you're going to get a story that makes Israel look pretty bad. I was a reporter for the AP between 2006 and the very end of 2011 in Jerusalem. I was a reporter and editor. And then I had an inside view inside one of the biggest AP bureaus, in fact, the AP's biggest international bureau, which was in Jerusalem. There are 2 major problems that are much bigger, and because they're bigger, they're often harder to see. One of the things that I noticed at the bureau was the scale of coverage of Israel. So at the time that I was at the AP, again, between 2006 and the very end of 2011, we had about 40 full-time staffers covering Israel. Israel, as most of you probably know, is a very small country. We covered Israel more than we covered any other country in the world. If the news is meant to be a rational analysis of events on planet Earth, you cannot cover Israel more than you cover the continent of Africa. It just doesn't make any sense. So one of the things that first jumped out at me, and I just started realizing that it was very strange that the world's largest organization had its largest international bureau in the state of Israel, which is a very small country, very small conflict in numeric terms, and yet there was this intense global focus on it that made people think that it was the most important story in the world, and it definitely occupies a place in the American political imagination that is not comparable to any other international conflict. So that's one part of the problem. The other part was the context, and it took me a while to figure this out, but the coverage of Israel is framed as an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The conflict is defined in those terms, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and everyone in this room has heard it discussed in those terms. Sometimes we discuss it in those terms, and that is because the news folks have framed the conflict in those terms. So at the AP Bureau in Jerusalem, every single day we had to write a story that was called, in the jargon of the Bureau, Is Pals? Israelis, Palestinians, and it was the daily wrap of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So what Netanyahu said, what Abbas said, rockets, settlers, Hamas, whatever. The problem is that there isn't an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I know that sounds crazy because everyone thinks there is, and of course, we're seeing the conflict play out in the most tragic way right now in Gaza. But most of Israel's wars have not been fought against Palestinians. Israel has unfortunately fought wars against Egyptians and Jordanians and Lebanese and Iraqis, and Israel's most important enemy at the moment is Iran, right? The Iranians are not Palestinian. The Iranians are not Arab. They're Muslim, but they're not Arab. So clearly there is a broader regional conflict that's going on that is not an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And we've seen it in the past year. If we had a satellite in space looking down and just following the paths of ballistic missiles and rockets fired at Israel. So we just have like a photograph of these red trails of rockets fired at Israel. You'd see rockets being fired from Iraq and from Yemen and from Lebanon and from Gaza and from Iran. You'd see the contours of a regional conflict. And if you understand it's a regional conflict, then you understand the way Israelis see it. There are, in the Arab world, 300 million people, almost all of them Muslim. And in one corner of that world, there are 7 million Jews who are Israelis. And if we zoom out even farther to the level of the Islamic world, we'll see that there are 2 billion people in the Islamic world. There's some argument about the numbers. The entire Jewish population on planet Earth is a lot smaller than the population of Cairo. So the idea that this is an Israeli-Palestinian conflict where Israelis are the stronger side, where Israelis are the dominant actor, and where Israelis are, let's face it, the bad guy in the story, that's a fictional presentation of a story that actually works in a completely different way. So if you take a small story and make it seem big, and if you take a complicated regional story and you make it seem like a very small local story involving only Israelis and Palestinians, then you get the highly simplified but very emotive narrative that everyone is being subjected to now, and you get this portrayal of a villainous country called Israel that really looms in the liberal imagination of the West as an embodiment of the worst possible qualities of the age. The issues that I saw in the press 15 years ago have only been exacerbated since then, and October 7th didn't invent the wheel. The issues were pre-existing, but it took everything that I saw and kind of supercharged it. What I saw happening at the AP, and I hate picking on the AP because they were just unfortunate enough to hire me. That was their only error. But what I'm saying about them is true of the whole news herd. It's true of the Times and CNN and the BBC. The news industry really works kind of it has a herd mentality. What happened was that news decisions were increasingly being made by people who were not interested in explanatory journalism. They were activists. Activists had moved into the key positions in the Bureau, and they had a very different idea of what press coverage was supposed to do. I would say, and I think I tried to explain it in that article for the Free Press, when I approach a news story, when I approach the profession of journalism, the question that I'm asking is, what's going on? The question that was increasingly being asked was not what's going on. The question was, who does this serve? That's an activist question. So when you look at a story, you don't ask, is it true or is it not true? You ask, who's it going to help? Is it going to help the good guys or is it going to help the bad guys? So if Israel in the story is the villain, then a story that makes Israel seem reasonable or rational or sympathetic needs to be played down to the extent possible or made to disappear. And I can give you an example from my own experience. At the very end of 2008, 2 reporters in my bureau, people who I know, learned of a very dramatic peace offer that Prime Minister Ehud Olmert had made to the Palestinians. So Olmert, who was the Prime Minister at the time, had made a very far-reaching offer that was supposed to see a Palestinian state in all of Gaza, most of the West Bank, with land swaps for territory that Israel was going to retain, and a very far-reaching international consortium agreement to run the old city of Jerusalem. It was a very dramatic, it was so far-reaching, I think, that Israelis probably wouldn't have supported it, but it was offered to the Palestinian side, and the Palestinians rejected it as insufficient. And 2 of our reporters knew about this, and they'd seen a map of the offer, and this was obviously a pretty big story for a bureau that had as the thrust of its coverage the peace process. The 2 reporters who had the story were ordered to drop it. They were not allowed to cover the story, and there were different explanations, and they didn't, by the way. AP did not publish the story at the time, even though we were the first to have it. Eventually it kind of came out in other ways through other news organizations, but we knew it first. Why were we not allowed to cover it? Because it would have made the Israelis, who we were trying to villainize and demonize, it would have made Israel seem like it was trying to solve the conflict on kind of unreasonable lines, which of course was true at that time. So that story would have upended the thrust of our news coverage, so it had to be made to go away, even though it was true. It would have helped the wrong people. And that question of who does this serve has destroyed, I don't want to say all, but much of what used to be mainstream news coverage. And it's not just where Israel is concerned, but Israel coverage ends up being a symptom of something much bigger, as Jews often are the symptom of something much bigger that's going on. So my problems in the AP Bureau 15 years ago were really a kind of maybe a canary in the coal mine, or a whiff of something much bigger that we were all going to see happen, which is the transformation of the important liberal institutions of the West into kind of activist arms of a very radical ideology that has as its goal the transformation of the West into something else. And that's true of the press, and it's true of the NGO world, places like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, which were one thing 30 years ago and are something very different today. And it's also true of big parts of the academy. It's true of places like Columbia and places like Harvard. They still have the logo, they still have the name, but they serve a different purpose. And I just happen to be on the ground floor of it as a reporter. Journalism is power, and the power has to be wielded in support of justice. So when the journalists become activists, then no one can understand what's going on, because the story itself is fake. And there are many examples of it, but returning to what you asked about October 7th and reporting post-October 7th, you can really see it happen. The massacres of October 7th were very problematic for the ideological stream that now controls a lot of the press, because it's counterintuitive. You're not supposed to sympathize with Israelis, and yet there were a few weeks after October 7th when they were forced to, because the nature of the atrocities were so heinous that they could not be ignored. So you had the press covering what happened on October 7th, but you can feel it as someone who knows that scene. You could feel there was a lot of discomfort. There was a lot of discomfort. It wasn't their comfort zone. And you knew that within a few weeks, maybe a month, it was going to snap back at the first opportunity. When did it snap back? In the story of the El Ahli hospital strike. If you remember that a few weeks in, there's a massive global story that Israel has rocketed a hospital in Gaza and killed about 500 people. And then you can see the comfort zone return, because the story that the press is primed to cover is a story about villainous Israelis victimizing innocent Palestinians. And now we're back. Okay, now Israel's rocketing a hospital. The problem was that it hadn't happened. A lot of stories don't happen and they're allowed to stand. Okay, but this story was so far from the truth that even the people involved couldn't make it work, and it had to be retracted. But it was basically too late. And then, as soon as the Israeli ground offensive got into swing in Gaza, then the story really becomes the same old story, which is a story of Israel victimizing Palestinians for no reason. And you'll never see Hamas militants in uniform in Gaza. You just see dead civilians, and you'll see the aftermath of a rocket strike when when an Israeli F-16 takes out the launcher. But you will never see the strike, which is the way it's worked in Gaza since the very end of 2008, which is when the first really bad round of violence in Gaza happens, which is when I'm at the AP.